Good evening, everybody. My name is James Crabtree. I'm the Executive Director of the IISS Asia office in Singapore. You're joining us this evening for the launch of a new IISS report, Great Power Offensive Cyber Campaigns, written by my colleague Greg Austin and two other authors. And in particular, we're going to focus this evening on Russia and Ukraine and the role that cyber operations have played in the ongoing conflict. Given the events of today, however, we thought it would be unusual if we started this event without referencing what has been a dramatic and alarming day in global affairs, given events in Ukraine. And so we're going to run this session slightly differently from the way that we had planned. We have three speakers who I will introduce in a minute. And what we will ask them to do, or what I will ask them to do, is to reflect briefly for a number of minutes at the beginning of this discussion on the events that all of us will have been watching on television and on the internet today in Ukraine. Having done that, we will then turn to the topic at hand, namely the role that offensive cyber campaigns play in general, which is the topic of the IISS's new research report, looking at the role that offensive cyber has been playing in the military offensives of the United States, China, and Russia. And so we will look in particular at the role in the current Ukraine crisis and how it might play out in future. So our three speakers, in the order in which you will hear them: first, my colleague Greg Austin, who joins us here in Singapore. Greg leads the cyberspace and emerging conflict program at the IISS and is the co-author of the report that is being launched today. Secondly, joining us very early in the morning from Georgia in the United States is Nadiya Kostyuk, who is an associate professor at the School of Public Policy at the Georgia Institute of Technology. I should say, as will become clear, that Nadiya is also a Ukrainian national. Her research looks at different elements of conflict, but in particular cyber conflict. And then third, we have Dr. Eneken Tikk, who leads the Power and Influence Studies unit at the Cyber Policy Institute in Finland. And so, as she just told us beforehand, is currently sitting 30 miles from the Russian border, and therefore has a reasonable vantage point with which to look at the events that are unfolding. So the way that we will run this session is as follows. As I said, each of our three speakers will reflect briefly on the events of the day, and then we will turn to more substantive comments on the issue of cyber. They will each speak for up to 10 minutes on that topic. Then we'll have a short discussion amongst ourselves, and then I'll open up the discussion for questions. Questions can be left at any time in the chat function, or the Q&A function that you can see on the slide here. So just leave the questions there and we'll answer as many as possible in the final half hour of this webinar. So with that, let me move forward. And firstly, given the events of the day, let us talk briefly about what we've seen happening in Ukraine. Greg, if I can turn first to you. Greg, you're on mute.
Thank you, James. I think the first thing I'd like to say is that as horrific as the events of the day are, it's not quite the full-blown military occupation and full-blown invasion that we were fearing. I think Putin has set himself a set of limited objectives, such as demilitarization. That's going to be almost impossible without large-scale resistance. But from here, I think we're facing a very complex political battle, and it's far from clear that all sides of the conflict, Russia, Ukraine, NATO, and the EU, have mapped out what this next phase of the conflict looks like. So I think people need to turn very quickly to establishing some milestones, some objectives, and understanding the levers that might be brought to bear in this new phase of conflict. Thank you, James.
Thanks, Greg. Nadiya, turning to you, I know you've only just morning in Georgia, but maybe you could give us some reflections on how this looks from the Ukrainian side and what you're hearing as you watch the pictures on television.
So I would say that contrary to what Greg said, from the sort of Ukrainian side, from the my conversations with the people and even my own expectations, my hope was that the invasion wouldn't be as sort of full-blown as it is. We obviously were expecting that they would occupy the Luhansk and Donetsk region, they would go to Kiev. But looking at the map of shelling that the New York Times produced this morning, it's sort of all over western parts of Ukraine, it's all over the south. It's, Russian tanks crossed the Belarusian border, which is, again, talking to people, no one expected this kind of stuff. One thing that I actually wanted to mention that I just realized now, and I don't know if it's just coincidence, but I realized that around this time, actually on February 22nd, 8 years ago, President Yanukovych left Ukraine, right? He fled Ukraine and went to Russia. And I'm not too sure if this date has any particular meaning or anything, or maybe, again, it's just a coincidence, but it could be a sort of important reminder for us that, you got rid of the Russian, pro-Russian candidate 8 years ago, and now we are back.
Thank you, Nadiya. Again, we much appreciate you joining us here this evening. It must be a difficult time to watch this, so much appreciate that. Eneken, do you have any reflections on your side on the events of the day before we return to the cyber topic?
Yes, well, obviously today has been filled with thoughts and conversations on this theme. Just before joining this session, I was on a session with colleagues, and a good colleague pointed out that Russia has, well, maybe unlike what one could expect, or what we normally have in situations where such drastic moves are made, that no single or clear justification has been offered. Like there have been references to the threat of genocide, or framing it as a military, a special operation, but not really like this framing of what would justify the move. And that led me just to think that it is now this, it feeds to the Russian proposition that international law is actually rather poorly equipped, and the West is poorly equipped to draw international law in situations that are not black and white. And also at the same time that it puts the pressure now on those of us who insist on the rule of law to phrase, to spell out those rules that are currently violated. So just a gauntlet down to us.
Okay, thank you, Eneken, and thank you to the three of you. So let's return to the topic at hand, which is the report that Greg and his co-authors have written on great power offensive cyber operations. The report deals with the United States, China, and Russia, but for the purposes of this evening, we're going to focus on Russia and Ukraine, although I'm sure Greg would be happy to talk about how Russia's approach compares to the other two great powers. So, Greg, do you think I can ask you to kick off just by giving a sense of the report, and in particular what we've learned about Russia's use of offensive cyber campaigns?
Yes, thank you, James. Well, let me start on the topic of the moment. Interestingly, the report found that Russia has been the most aggressive actor in cyberspace of the three major powers that we looked at, US, China, and Russia, and that Ukraine has been the biggest victim, or the most regular victim of Russia's aggressiveness in cyberspace. Now, we might reflect, what does that tell us about where this conflict was headed? Because, for example, one of the other case studies we looked at was Russia's support for the Assad regime in Syria. And what we didn't see in Syria, even though there are relatively high stakes, what we didn't see in Syria was widespread use by Russia of cyber operations in the same way that it conducted cyber operations against Ukraine. We've seen everything in Ukraine, really, from attacks on critical infrastructure to attacks on what you might call social infrastructure and economic infrastructure, all sorts of attacks on business operations. The NotPetya attack in 2017 went global and caused devastation around the world, or a large lot of damage. So it's quite interesting that even though we're going to say some things tonight which suggest that Russia didn't use offensive cyber operations as much as it might have in Ukraine. There are some really interesting sort of telltale signs around the use of offensive operations that we see from the Russia-Ukraine case that we need to take account of. So that's the first point. The second point, I guess, is what people have been saying for a long time. Compared with a missile hitting the Ministry of Defense in Ukraine, what good is a cyber attack? As we look today at the pictures from Kiev of the burning or small fire, I suppose, in the Ministry of Defense headquarters in Kiev, that sort of might ask us to question, well, what possible good could cyber attacks be compared with the sort of attacks, kinetic attacks, that Russia has unleashed? Now, that's definitely the thinking of the leaders of the Russian armed forces, which is my view of why they've not pursued offensive cyber operations as much as they might have in this campaign. In fact, what we've seen by and large in the Russian attacks on Ukraine since 2013 in cyberspace have been largely harassment type attacks, low level. Some had effects which lasted for some months, but most of them were relatively short-lived. So in a sense, we can see what the Russians were doing pretty much as experimental. But one thing we need to take account of in respect of countries like China and the United States especially, but also Russia, is that while they haven't used this instrument in the way that they might have, they haven't unleashed the full destructive potential of cyber offense. They are planning to. And so one of the interesting things about this report, I think, is that even though we conclude that the use of offensive cyber weapons has so far been relatively limited for what you might call strategic pressure or strategic coercion, and in fact, we reached the conclusion that by and large, we haven't really seen cyber coercion from either the United States, Russia, or China. So where does that leave us? And I think the answer is that we have to take account of what the secret agencies in these countries and some of the military agencies are actually planning to do. And the United States clearly sets the pace in this. And a senior military officer from the United States, the former commander of the Indo-Pacific Command, said in public that he believes that the United States has the capability to penetrate the networks of a foreign government. This was in a long speech about China, by the way, or just followed a section on China in a speech. He said the United States has the power to penetrate the networks of a foreign power, paralyze its decision-making, and thereby blunt the kinetic value of their armed forces. So that's where people are headed in terms of military thinking. But when we come back to Russia, we began to wonder when we saw the limited use of offensive cyber operations in Syria, we began to wonder if there was some limitation on the resource availability to the GRU in Russia. How many people are actually working in terms of offensive cyber operations? By comparison, for example, we know from the commander of Cyber Command in the United States, General Nakasone, that in total, the workforce committed to both offensive and defensive cyber in the United States defense establishment is 238,000 people. Now, I doubt that Russia has got half of that many people working in the same missions in the Russian armed forces. So I think there's a question of how many do they have, how skilled are they, and what's the link between their skills and decision-making, training and policy planning in the Russian armed forces. I also think that there's a problem of imagination at the highest levels of the Russian government in terms of how they might imagine the effective application of offensive cyber operations against their potential targets. As a final point, let me say that I think that as we go forward, we might think about what the resistance to the Russian invasion in Ukraine looks like in cyberspace. So we know of some groups in Ukraine that were active in 2013, 2014. We haven't heard much of those in recent years, but we also know that countries like the United States and the UK will be taking a view of the possible use of cyber responses to the Russian kinetic invasion of Ukraine. So there's a few things ahead of us in where cyber tools and offensive cyber operations are heading. And I think the cyber front is going to be far more interesting, far more decisive, and in a sense shaped by this cauldron of war than we've seen so far in the past 8 years. Thanks, James.
Thank you, Greg. Okay, so that gets us kicked off in style. In the discussion, I may come back and ask you just to say a little bit about what we've learned in the course of this research about the different approaches of Russia, China, and the United States. But let's keep our focus on events in Russia and Ukraine. Nadiya, let me turn to you next. Might you give us some reflections on what we've seen since 2013, but in particular in the most recent months, and where you think this might go next?
Thank you, James. So around the time when Russia placed a troop on the Ukrainian border at the beginning of December, at the end of November, we've seen two different narratives in media about the role of cyber in the potential conflict. On the one side, we've seen scholars, policymakers saying that cyber will play a complementary role to the use of military force. On the other side, we've seen scholars saying that Russia doesn't even need to use cyber operations because cyber strikes can achieve much the same effect across the border. As we've seen, today and the earlier events of this week, the substitution hypothesis or substitution expectations that we've seen in December obviously no longer hold. But also, I think we should be very careful about the strategic value of the complementary use of cyber operations in Ukraine, and explain why this is the case. As Greg mentioned, Ukraine has a long history of being used as a test ground of the Russian cyber operation. Russia has been practicing different types of attacks on Ukraine for the past 8 years. Right, so we've seen Ukraine experience attacks which thought to sabotage an opponent's ability to fight. Also, we've seen a track record of cyber operations as standalone instruments used in the gray zone conflict, which included election interference, critical infrastructure sabotage, and economic disruptions. And in order to understand whether future cyber operations can help Russia achieve strategic goals, we need to reflect on that existing research. So particularly, I would like to briefly mention the two studies. One is the one that I co-authored with Dr. Yuri Zhukov from the University of Michigan. And there we examine the role of low-level cyber operations during the military conflict in Ukraine, particularly during the height of this conflict in 2014, between 2014 and 2016. We applied a series of statistical tests to 1,000 of cyber and conventional operations, and we didn't find any reciprocity between cyber operations or any coordination between the use of cyber and conventional operations by either side. Again, not surprising. But basically what the study concludes is that in contrast to the expectation, a sort of theoretical discussion, the cyber could be a force multiplier used during conflict. We didn't see this effect, at least in the case of Ukraine. Another study would also explain the sort of the challenging in using cyber operations as a tool of subversion is a study by Dr. Leonard Meschmeyer from the University of Zurich. And he focuses on these 5 major disruptive campaigns that Russia's sponsored hacking groups took in Ukraine, which is again, election interference, attacks against electric power grid in Ukraine, economic disruption in the form of non-petya, etc. And what Leonard's argue is that cyber operations as instruments of subversions, even though there is a great perceived strategic promise to use them, they have limited practical value. And the reason is because there's a challenge involved in secrecy when adversaries trying to use them before the victim can actually react and neutralize the explosion. As a result, this challenge produces an operational dilemma between the speed intensity of effects and the level of control the actors can achieve. And this trilemma, it limits the strategic value of these operations, making cyber operations slow, too weak, and too volatile to contribute measurably to strategic goals. So what does these two studies and other studies on this topic tell us about the future use of cyber operations, right? So of course, this evidence suggests that cyber operations are neither likely to be used as substitutes or complements to military effectiveness, but this is neither to say that cyber operations not strategically irrelevant, nor the cyber operations used to support conventional operations on the technical level cannot create strategic effects. But again, we haven't seen this in the case of Ukraine. And if you look at the recent attacks that took place over the last 2 months, we would conclude the same, right? So in January, we had defacement campaigns that affected 70 Ukrainian websites. Again, they were sort of minor, they were largely inconsequential, insignificant. No data was lost or completely destroyed, it was quickly recovered. Then we had the Whispergate, which was the pseudo ransomware attack. Again, it didn't cause very significant damage. Then last week, we have an attack on the Privatbank, which is the nation's largest commercial bank. And again, we have to think about the sort of what this type of attack in Ukraine the damage from this type of attack can be sort of on a very different scale, a level than it is on an attack in the United States. Because people in Ukraine, they are not relying on online banking as much, they're not depending on the online banking as it is in, let's say, in the United States. So again, the damage was very minor and the services were very quickly restored. And also we had the websites of the Ukraine's defense ministry. Also yesterday, we had attacks on Ukraine parliament, governmental agencies, but again, the damage wasn't sort of detrimental. And so if we think about the potential threats that Ukraine could be facing, I would distinguish the following two. Of course, there is no doubt that Russia will be continuing penetrating Ukrainian networks. And the reason I'm saying will be because there's no doubt that Russia has been in Ukrainian networks for some time, has been conducting cyber espionage operations. Some of these turn into actual attacks. Some of them, they're just sort of sitting and waiting for a momentum. But again, the effect and significance of these attacks could be limited, as demonstrated by the Russian attacks against Ukrainian power grid in 2015 and 2016. Additionally, we could see potential unintended disruption, which again, we saw as a result of NotPetya in 2017. But again, we have to think about sort of the potential strategic value and the cost of this attack. So because of this disruption outside of Ukraine, NotPetya affected not only Western nation, but also it affected the state-controlled giant Rosneft, right? So it had a very clear cost to the Russian Federation itself. And also as a result of this attack, Western country imposed Russian sanctions on the Russian Federation, which again has some sort of additional costs and political implications. So looking forward to sum this all up, of course, there is no doubt there will be some opportunities for deception, potential espionage, sabotage, and also psychological effects in the form of disinformation operation that I didn't even touch on in this, against adversary population and against population and adversary forces. Of course, cyber operations could occasionally produce measurable and even significant strategic effect. However, as we've seen again from the events today, I would argue that in most circumstances, military force will be the primary tool and cyber operations will not be the game changer in this new phase of conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadiya. That was comprehensive and well put, and with some read across to what Greg said. So for our final introductory comment, let me turn to Finland and to Eneken Tikk. So Eneken, over to you.
Thank you, and just to build on what Nadiya observed, just another observation that at the same time in peacetime, cyber operations provide a great way to provoke and in a way escalate in a controlled environment. So Well, my remarks, I wanted to interact with some some points of the report. One about campaigns more broadly, and then with this question of what have we learned about the concept of vulnerability and offense in the example of Russia and Ukraine that is also relevant for the broader international community. And finally, going to this question of what is unleashed and then what's coming. So on campaigns, one thing that that I was left wondering with is like, to what extent can this Russian aggression towards Ukraine can be regarded as an independent campaign compared to, for example, this other framing of Sino-Russo determination to disrupt the Western cohesion and undermine the liberal world order. And especially in the recent events in Ukraine, we have seen that these things are intertwined. They are directed as much against one as the other. And then, of course, the big question in not just the cyber community, but other communities, I think, is to what extent are these cyber campaigns cyber campaigns and not the current play of long unresolved and ever deteriorating international relations. So what's the dog and where's the tail? So all in all, I believe that when it comes to campaigns, we have to accept that there is some subjectivity and interpretation in how we approach them. Then on this question of what's the broader lessons in this discussion that we are currently engaged with, I see there are some pretty obvious things. First, between rivals and adversaries, also competitors, cyber is an element to be brought to play. And this, regardless of our norms and commitments to international law in cyberspace, I think Russia has somewhat successfully demonstrated over and over that we have real difficulties pulling international law as a red card to bully players or against bully players. So determined actors get away with cyber offensive and for the reasons we have discussed, like partially because it is kept at bay, right? And when real capabilities and real, acute conflict breaks, then cyber becomes somewhat irrelevant, auxiliary. And this week's engagement, for example, cyber attacks against Ukrainian government institutions should make us think about the sustainability of our digitalization, which goes to the Russian bottom line of digitalization is dangerous. And in situations not just where our critical infrastructure doesn't necessarily have a non-cyber alternate running mode, but also the way our governments coordinate, consolidate, make decisions, that all gets under heavy pressure in parallel to acute crisis that needs to be reminded. Also, I'd say that in a way, Ukraine is a blueprint for likely targets of cyber offense more broadly, with low resilience, relatively underdeveloped national organizational cybersecurity, also having a clear unresolved difference or more with a major power. And it's important for us to acknowledge here that this lack of resilience or our vulnerability is not just technical. It is a societal, governmental, deep vulnerabilities and issues that fuel not necessarily the causes. These are geopolitical largely, and nothing has changed here, but the enablers, how likely we are good targets, lucrative targets, and successful victims from an offense perspective. And that goes to political stigmatization of potential target countries, endorsement of cyber operations against opponents, political opponents, economic rivals, insufficient follow-on or like attention to earlier earlier similar scenarios materializing from the same actor in other countries, or then just societal overall low resilience at the same time, this ever increasing dependence. So when it comes to this question, like to what extent we see this fully unleashed or then potentially to be unleashed cyber capabilities, I would say in the context of this discussion of enablers, it's not just about causes, it's what makes us easy targets. There's no need for obviously to unleash any more than that currently has been. And where Russia has opted for cyber offense, Ukraine or elsewhere, it has always, in my view, reinforced the Russian bottom lines. Digitalization is dangerous, international law is insufficient, and states have sovereign right to stop innovation and information at their borders. So to wrap it up, I would say where we credit Russia for skillfully playing the diplomatic card as an underdog in the development and use of information communication technologies in the 90s, starting this whole UN road for us to pick up the conversation. I think we need to accept that in 2022, in the world where especially liberal democracies have a huge self-inflicted vulnerability, Russia is a top dog. Thank you.
Thank you, Eneken. Okay, that was a great introduction, and also thanks to those of you watching at home. We've got a range of interesting questions which are piling up in the Q&A box, and so we'll get to those shortly. Please do drop your questions in there, and as some of you have been doing, if you'd be kind enough to leave your name and your professional title and organization if that's relevant, and I'll get to the questions as soon as I can. Greg, let me just, we are ostensibly launching your report here this evening. There's some commonality across the three introductory remarks, which is to focus on the limitations of cyber, and on a day in which we've seen an invasion, clearly that strikes a chord. The subtitle of the new report is Experiments in Cyber Power. Do you think you could explain why you and your co-authors came to the conclusion that the kind of activities we've seen in Russia and elsewhere are merely experiments and aren't actually intended to directly coerce or change state behavior?
Yes, thank you, James. So having mentioned my authors, let me just acknowledge Munish Sharma, who's in the audience tonight, and Kailin Tay, who contributed to the report. So thank you, Munish and Kailin. So we started the report thinking that we could find examples in the behavior of Russia, China, and the United States where cyber power had been used for coercion, where there was an expectation on the part of the state leaders using the cyber instrument that they would bring about a change in the behavior of the state, the target state, as a result of the cyber operation. We thought we would find it, but we didn't. So even in the case, for example, of the United States attack on Iran with Stuxnet, the reason for undertaking that attack was largely to demonstrate that non-kinetic options were available on the one hand, but on the other hand, with Israel in mind, to demonstrate that non-kinetic options might be preferable to bombing Iran and bombing the nuclear facilities. So when George Bush asked for a non-kinetic, or he asked, is there something we can do that doesn't involve bombs, was his basic question, if I can paraphrase it. So when it was all authorized, it's far from clear that he had any expectation that it would change Iran's behavior. And in fact, 3,000 destroyed centrifuges later, it probably didn't deter or dissuade Iran from pursuing the course that it had pursued. And as we went through the various case studies, 10 of them in all, perhaps with the possible exception of the United States campaign against Islamic State in cyberspace, we really couldn't sort of see a strong link between what the leadership expected in applying the cyber instrument and any sort of strategic outcomes. And even in the case of the campaign against Islamic State by the United States, the cyber campaign, we saw very limited strategic aspirations. We saw the main game as lying elsewhere. So we use the term experiments, perhaps a little, what's the word, as a convenient coverall for this range of situations in these three countries where there was a mismatch between the obvious availability of capabilities, but uncertain evolution in the thinking of the political leaders and the military leaders about how valuable these instruments were, and at the end of the day, even a lack of commitment by the political and military leaders to what you might call aggressive development of the cyber instrument. Thanks, James.
Thanks, Greg. I'm going to turn back to Nadiya and Eneken in a minute. I just thought it was important to get that on the table, that the report we're launching this evening takes a case study-based approach. It looks at 3 uses of offensive cyber by Russia, one of which is Ukraine, and then a number of other case studies involving China and the United States. So that's where we're drawing this from. But let's return our focus more directly to Ukraine. I mean, Greg, and then I'll go back to Nadiya and Eneken. Nadiya gave us a chronology of some of the cyber attacks that we saw in the prelude to today's invasion. Covering defacement, the Whispergate, the attack on the banks, various other things. I wondered if, Greg, first you, maybe, and then a little bit more, Nadiya and Eneken, if you could just say a bit more about what has struck you about the use of cyber in the run-up to this invasion. As a number of you have said, Russia has targeted the Ukraine with cyber attacks since 2013. But what have we seen that is new in the last couple of months, or in a sense, is this just a continuation of the way that Russia has acted previously? So Greg first, and then I'll turn to Nadiya and then Eneken.
Yeah, thanks, James. Well, I think largely what we've seen from Russia in the last, so the mid-January attack, the mid-February attack, and then just in the last 2 days, really is a continuation of low-level, low-outcome type attacks. And I was saying to someone today, if it had been the United States or Israel planning this attack on a country like Ukraine, they would have had offensive cyber operations all over it. They would have attacked the electric grid, they would have attacked the air defense systems with cyber attacks, they would have attacked other critical infrastructure. And if we go back to 1999, the NATO campaign against Yugoslavia, or in fact the US bombing campaign, there was a clear effort to target critical infrastructure by the United States in cyberspace. People have different views on the extent to which that happened, but we can certainly say that today, if it had been the United States or Israel in this sort of attack against a country like Ukraine, described aptly by Nadiya as being very weak and very vulnerable, a sentiment echoed by Eneken, I think we would have seen a very different set of outcomes in cyberspace. Thank you.
Nadiya, maybe I could turn to you. You already gave us the list in a sense of what we've seen, but what struck you as, has the way that Russia has used cyber in this prelude to invasion been different from the way it has acted before? Have we seen a new playbook, or is it similar to the way they have previously acted?
So I would agree with Greg that it's not too much new. We've seen a generally continuation, but also we can see from the technical evidence that some of these attacks were very opportunistic and short, and there's some short-term planning, right? So if we look at the first attack that I mentioned, the defacement campaigns that targeted 70 Ukrainian websites, this intrusion exploited this log4j vulnerability, which has been only discovered a few weeks earlier, right? And also what is interesting about this particular campaign, the defacement campaign and also Whispergate, is the timing. If I believe correctly, they occurred during the time when there was a first NATO discussion with Russia, and there were a series of visits. So I think it could be sort of, again, they were quickly put together, rushed through and saying, okay, we really want to work with you, but also look how dangerous we are, we can do all these things. But then again, when we took some time and looked at the impact of these operations, we realized, again, there was no serious damage done. There was no sort of ransomware requested, right? No data lost, etc. So I think what could be another possible explanation, in addition sort of to trying to influence the NATO leaders, is also to creating some sort of fear and panic among the population, right? Showing, okay, look how weak the government is. They cannot even protect their own websites. So to undermine, again, their support of the Ukrainian government by using the cyber operations. And one thing I think what is sort of, I believe, less covered in the Western media, which was sort of very prevalent among Ukrainian, is this a lot of the disinformation campaign, especially there were a lot of fake news about having potential bombs placed in schools, in the subway, etc. And all of this created a great panic among populations. Again, even though population people realize that a lot of them they were fake, but still, when you go into the subway and you hear maybe there is a bomb, maybe not, people started worrying about the possible evolution of this conflict. So I think, like, when we talk about cyber, we also should spend a little bit of time discussing how the propaganda disinformation campaign was also an important component of the sort of digital effort, not only in social media, by TV, by various platforms that preceded the military invasion.
That's fascinating. I mean, Eneken, basically the same question to you, and then I have a follow-up for all three of you. But did you share this analysis of what we've seen? I mean, what has caught your eye over the last couple of weeks about the way this has been deployed?
Thanks, and I'll be short because I think I largely agree with many points already made. To me too, but maybe one thing that strikes me again and again is that when we talk about these major cyber powers, then Russian cyber attacks and operations are perhaps least surgical of the three, and it's this tolerance like of this margin of error, even potential embarrassment. It's sort of like just enough to take the opportunity where the window is open, and I think Russia is really good at doing that, and in more cases it pays off than not. And then that goes to also this combination of directing cyber where it matters. So, for example, in anticipation of a conflict or less an outbreak of hostilities, to keep the tension up, to alert the population, and then when things get into this like really acute crisis, wake of conflict, then to start undermining government coordination and population communication with the population. So it's not a new pattern, it's just a skill that is demonstrated over and over.
So Eneken, and then I'll go to the other of you if you want to chime in. I mean, it seems we have an interesting kind of conclusion here, that you all seem to agree that despite the fact there's been a lot of focus on Russian use of cyber, that Russia has not deployed a substantial cyber effect that has a real effect on outcomes. It's more of what Greg has called experiments, minor effects. Greg outlined, in a sense, two reasons why that might be the case. One, which is that Russia has the capability to do this, but is unconvinced that it would achieve anything very much. And then, as secondarily, that perhaps there are resource issues, that they, maybe they do not have the capability to do this, and don't have as many people. Eneken, since you were speaking, what's your sense of this? I mean, how do you explain the fact that these cyber attacks have, in a sense, not been deployed to the extent that some analysts had feared?
Well, I would say overall, cyber conflict has not gotten to the threshold where we all have fear. So we came to this conversation from this the cyber doom and cyber 9/11, meaning none of that really is materializing. And I think in the Russian context, there's, like, I would agree with Greg's diagnosis, that there's both, that there's on the one hand capabilities need constant development, and therefore like testing them whenever there's an opportunity, and that is one Russian like true strength. Seeing and seizing opportunity is a great way of further developing them. And on the other hand, this reassuring that the capabilities where they exist, their effects can be tested, meaning seeing that they create the effect that is currently needed, and therefore mastering them further in the process.
Nadiya, do you have a view on that question as to what's going on here?
Yeah, absolutely. So we seem to agree on all of this today, which is great. My sort of response would be in a form of question to you: does it need to, right? What is the actual impact? So when we conducted our study in Ukraine a few years ago, which I think some of these points are still relevant, I did some interviews with the experts from Ukraine and Russia, and I asked, why don't we see so much cyber, right? Because again, before the start of the conflict, there was a lot of discussion, oh, it will be a new digital front. We see Russia using cyber all over Ukraine, and it did, but it's not to an extent, and also the value was very limited. And so the explanations that we got was that Russia has been in the Ukrainian systems for a long time because Ukraine relied on the Russians developed, critical infrastructure, hardware, etc., swarm systems. Of course, since the start of the conflict, Ukraine has been doing an excellent job of trying to reduce its reliance on these systems provided by Russia. But still, right? It's been in the system, has been collecting espionage, it has been collecting intelligence, has been using this information for combat and command to support its combat and command operations. And so again, the sort of value is not from actual destructive attacks; it's much lower than from that. Additionally, also what the Russian Federation saw early on. That switch to disinformation campaign and propaganda is much more useful. And that's, we've seen all these like Nazi stories or women being raped in the western part of Ukraine, or Ukraine, western part of Ukraine, crucified babies. But we've seen the same thing now, right? There's a lot of sort of discussion about this. Of course, the impact might be not as huge as it was in 2014 because people have learned about fake news, about disinformation operations, but still we've seen that preceding these attacks, there was a lot of sort of preparation of the public about sort of the importance of Russian effort on the humanitarian grounds, right? They were saying, we are here to defend you. If you're not with us, then this is what's going to be happening to you. But also, if we look at the sort of narratives that the Russian propagandists put in their disinformation campaign, has been switched. It had been switched. So at the beginning, it was like they were more pro-Russian, but then the last few months actually was more anti-West, right? They were sort of blaming anti-West on everything that is wrong in Ukraine. So my favorite sort of example is that they were saying, look at the roads in Ukraine. The reason they're so bad is because like you're working with the West, they don't provide any financial support for you, right? So it's like, again, for more educated people, right? It's like, it's sort of funny and we laugh. But my grandma, who has like 3 channels in the village, and she relies mostly, let's say, on one of the channels by the Russian, sponsored by the Russian media, it could have a long-term effect. And so I would say that the impact from the actual cyber operations is much lower in the case of Ukraine, and Russia doesn't have to burn its capabilities, but from sort of disinformation campaigns, it could be potentially more meaningful because it could turn the public and could provide, they could be more supportive of sort of actions of the Russian Federation if they're afraid of its own government.
Thanks, Nadiya. I mean, Greg, you may have views on this, and before we sort of throw it open to the audience and also sort of throw our mind forward to what might happen next on the cyber side and in general, I thought maybe we should just pause and address the question of how Russia's actions compares to the US in particular, but also China, the others in the publication. So do you want to unpick a couple of those, Greg?
Yeah, thank you, James. Well, as you were just talking to colleagues there about some explanations of why Russia is in the situation that it is, I was thinking the most important thing I'd like to say is that the United States and China are planning to do a whole lot better than Russia has done. And we can see this, it's sketched out in the report in respect of the 3 countries. There's a focus in each of the country chapters on what we call the institutional setting. So many people on the call would be familiar with the establishment of the Strategic Support Force in China in 2015. Most would understand be familiar with the formation of Cyber Command in 2010, and so on. And the evolution of capability, the evolution of commitment of the governments to this particular asset of military power and political power is unquestionable. In the United States, it's very firm, it's very highly developed. As I said, there's not high-level consensus at the highest levels of the United States government, but about how to use this and how to use it for strategic effect. But the consensus is building, and it's sort of much the same in China. There's a really big difference we find in the report between how the United States has used cyber power and how China has used it. And we found remarkably that given the high stakes that are involved in China's policies towards Taiwan, that we've seen almost no offensive cyber operations in the way that we define them in the report against Taiwan. And one of the reasons we give for that is that China has really good soft power assets in a small percentage of the population of Taiwan. It's also got other soft power assets in terms of economic relationships and the like. And one of our findings in the report is that where states have good soft power assets, they're less likely to reach for offensive cyber operations. And that's true of political influence type operations. But as we look to the military sphere, I think we have to be very conscious that the United States is, racing for the technological frontier in offensive military cyber operations, both of cyber sabotage and for cyber influence. It's not as well developed in psychological operations in the cyber sphere as some countries, such as Russia and China, are. But the United States is definitely racing for the technological frontier and winning. And China is trying to catch up. So as we look, perhaps not 5 years ahead, but 10 to 15 years, I think the situation that we're going to see in terms of the strategic value of cyberspace operations will be very different. Thanks, James.
Okay, thanks, Greg. I want to turn things over to questions. We've got a good long list of questions and hopefully more from the audience as we go along. And I want to focus in particular on what might happen next, what you think might happen. So we have a couple of questions which look to this, and I'll throw these out and unless they're directed to one of you individually. So we have a question from Rodrigo Mora, which said, are financial sanctions expected to have any effect on the capabilities of Russian cyber actors? So Greg, I'll throw that to you. And then again, Nadiya or Eneken, if you want to come in and just say.
Thank you, James. That's a very good question. I believe that though the United States and NATO countries have not said much about quote unquote technology sanctions, they will be a very big part of the package. And the announcement I'm waiting for, it may never come, but the announcement I'm waiting for is whether Microsoft will have to close its Moscow office, for example, under some sort of legislative requirement or regulatory requirement from the US government. It's very clear that Russia depends on the international ICT sector for a large part of its capabilities. And if that were to be denied Russia, then I think that it would be in a very difficult position. So let's see where that heads. Thank you.
Nadiya or Eneken, would either of you like to come in on that point? Nadiya, you've unmuted yourself.
Sure, yeah. I would say in terms of the economic sanctions specifically, I am less optimistic. I'm very pessimistic in the sense. Again, we've seen a number of economic sanctions against Russia for a lot of different actions, cyber and non-cyber, over the many years. Related to cyber, again, we've seen sort of economic actions imposed as a result of non-Petya attacks. But again, sort of even though they added some costs to the Russian Federation, the effects were limited, right? We've seen sort of the Russian government, the hacking group sponsored by the Russian government, they continue executing cyber attacks. So I think it's the first important step, but I would agree with Greg that those technical sanctions could have a larger effect than the economic sanctions. As the history has learned and has demonstrated, the latter hasn't been very effective.
Eneken, anything to add?
Yes, well, I would just to continue on these technical sanctions. I think these are even more costly on the West itself than currently the economic sanctions. So here we would also hit the ground where Western liberal Western governments and industry do not necessarily see eye to eye on a lot of this. And I would be also pessimistic about the economic sanctions being effective, because so far they haven't. It is not because of sanctions that Russia has also been successfully using proxy actors. And I'd say that it will just be able to rely on many of its further activities on further proxies if that becomes necessitated also by sanctions.
So thinking about the response, we had a question from Nicholas McLean. So as Russia is accused of launching covert critical attacks, he talks about on the West, but also on Ukraine recently, is this not the time for the West to experiment with cyber options to assist Ukraine and to disrupt Russian and Belarusian attacks? So I wondered if you had any thoughts on that. I mean, it seems clear to me, at least, that Western intelligence agencies and the cyber agencies have been working intensively on the Ukraine crisis, are likely to be in Ukraine in various different respects. Obviously, this is not something that appears much in the public domain, but do we have a sense of how the United States, United Kingdom, and other of the advanced cyber powers in the West might use their capabilities in this domain during the forthcoming conflict? Greg, again, I'll start with you and then go to Eneken and Nadiya.
Yeah, thank you, James. The NATO countries have made clear they won't fight on the ground in Ukraine, but they have the capability and almost certainly the intent that they will fight against the Russian invasion and occupation of Ukraine in cyberspace. They've been engaging with Russia in cyberspace in more and more proactive ways, defend forward on the cyber attacks. But we have a perfect opportunity now for the United States and the United Kingdom to put their well-established skills to highly targeted uses to disrupt the Russian government and the Russian occupation of Ukraine in cyberspace. The choice they'll have to make is, of course, whether they want to waste their good assets, so to speak, perhaps their intelligence knowledge of Russian systems, whether they want to use it now, use it and lose it in a Ukraine scenario, rather than save it for a much more higher intensity war. So that's a quick answer. Maybe let the others have a say.
Eneken, would you want to comment on this? Yeah.
Yeah, so I fully agree with Greg on that this would also require the commitment to expose one's capabilities. And I would even add here that this would require, like this now engaging in assistance or in support would require even more agile, even more targeted capabilities that I'm not sure have been at the heart of our cyber military capability development so far, but would be a great recommendation moving forward. And on the other hand, of course, there is the question of escalation that came up with in and around Stuxnet and the speculations that was that operation a countermeasure and therefore somehow legitimate. And I think we have already had this conversation that this visible operations draw the question of legitimacy in and of themselves. Finally, I think there are more effective ways to currently to weigh into the situation than cyber would necessarily be.
Nadiya?
I will not be original here. I do agree with the two sort of things that the West should contemplate, right? The burning the capability and the escalation that Greg and Eneken mentioned. It seems to me that, again, the Biden administration mentioned that they are ready to use asymmetric means. It means potentially sort of cyber. Also, there has been multiple sort of warnings from CISA about the potential risk of cyber attacks on the critical infrastructure. The UK and Western nations also have been preparing. So I think sort of they are waiting there is a chance that they could potentially launch an attack, but again, the costs are sort of higher to me than sort of being a target of an attack. And of course, if the Russian government decides to attack the objects of critical structures in the West, or potentially the attack on Ukraine can have a spillover effect on the West, I think that could be a sort of a logical way to respond. But I'm not too sure if they're going to be the first one to initiate sort of hack back, defend forward sort of strategy, because it's a little bit escalatory, and also it's the exploits are very valuable to the West.
Okay, so Greg, it's funny, I was about to ask you this exact same point that Nadiya just ended on. So she used the phrase defend forward. And I wonder, Greg, there might be some watching who don't know what that means. And you also, in a sense, in your previous answer, gave an interesting point that Western cyber agencies had potentially the option of launching cyber attacks of their own, but they might not want to do so because these are one-shot deals. And so could you explain, I mean, these are linked concepts, the defend forward, and can you just explain what you mean by that? Why is this a problem that they face?
Sure. Well, just quickly, between 2013 and 2016, the United States faced serious cyber attacks from several sources: Iran, North Korea, Russia, and China. By the time they got to 2016 and the Russian interference in the presidential election, President Obama was very firmly of the view that the cyber agencies had put forward, had agreed with the view that there was an opportunity here to interfere with the cyber operations of these adversaries in cyberspace, not to let them just happen, but to actually engage with the transfer of the malware and the like, and to reach back towards the systems from which these attacks were being generated in foreign countries. And so this was the origin of the concept of defend forward. So instead of waiting for the attacks to occur and try to stop them through passive defenses in your systems, to actually go out, meet the cyber adversary, so to speak, in their own systems. And so it was approved in 2018 under the term Cyber Deterrence Initiative, but was actually launched as a policy in 2016. So it's about taking the battle to the enemy, the adversary in cyberspace. And you might imagine that as these attacks have intensified from countries like China and Russia, the United States has also extended and deepened its defend forward operations. Thank you.
And so just the second point of that was can you just explain why it is the case that you may have to save your best cyber attacks and use them only once? Just again, there may be some people watching who might not understand why that is.
Well, it's a long-held precept amongst the cyber expert community that if you use it, you lose it. So you've revealed your hand to the adversary. I don't actually believe that. But another way of looking at it is that it takes really powerful intelligence collection to set up a highly effective cyber operation against a complex adversary system. Might take years of intelligence collection and then much less time to actually devise the attack package. And so it's not so much that you lose the advantage to use the same attack package again, but you might expose your knowledge, your intelligence knowledge, and other intelligence methods and processes by launching a particular cyber attack. So, for example, in the adversary relationship between the United States and Russia, one of the highest value sets of intelligence would relate to the movements and personal activities of President Putin. So a cyber attack that was directed at some aspect of that would reveal, this is all hypothetical, would potentially reveal that some of that information had been collected by covert human sources inside the Kremlin. I mean, just to make it sort of, in a sense, a plain example. So you don't want to burn your intelligence sources just for one successful cyber attack necessarily. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Eneken, you've got your hand up.
Yes, so I would just say that this defend forward, it has not necessarily gone all the way so well with all the like-minded, and I think there have been these serious conversations about, first of all, from Russian strategic perspective, getting the West down the road of securitization, and that means also on the defensive, which potentially undermines the very values that we are claiming to uphold in the whole conversation. And it also, I'd say, testifies of this, that negotiate forward has failed, so that there was now this need to reach for additional measures.
Okay, let me bring in a few other points. I mean, I wondered, there's a point raised by a couple of questioners about the prospects of cyber resistance in Ukraine, as in not so much the West, but Ukrainians themselves may use cyber as a way of resisting in the invasion, and we may, in a sense, get to a point where we see, insurgencies or resistance in Ukraine. I mean, I wonder if you might like to reflect on what we might see on that side of things. Nadiya, maybe I could start with you, given you know Ukraine best of all.
Sure, but also I read Greg's report, which I think he made some excellent points about that, so I'm going to repeat it. By cyber resistance, I guess it depends what the questions mean. So hopefully my interpretation of this is correct, right? So there could be sort of resistance by the government and by the cyber forces, by the cyber soldiers, if I can call them, right? By the cyber experts within the government. Again, as the three of us pointed, even though Ukraine has been building a cyber capability over the last again, as 8 years since 2014, it's not as strong as, it doesn't have as strong capabilities in terms of offensive or defensive as other nations. But we've seen that the US government, as well as the UK government, they send their cyber warfare teams to help Ukraine defend against the operations, and potentially, as we discussed, maybe there will be some even offensive responses from Ukraine. So we could see something out there, but again, sort of the scope and the scale of these operations in terms of the offensive, I would say, remain unknown. Also, in terms of the sort of resistance, we could see some, again, I think I'm the one who keeps bringing this sort of disinformation, information operations, but something that we saw at the earliest stages of the conflict is a lot of civil society groups, they organize to provide the sort of resilience against Russia's fake news. So one particular example was the civil society group called Stop Fake. And what they did, they actually went through a bunch of stories published by Russian media, and they actually did fact checking and demonstrating that a lot of the images that were produced that were fake, where they were taken from, etc., etc. And they done an excellent job, because they not only published this information just in Ukrainian, right? They published it in Ukrainian, in English, as well as in Russian, to hopefully reach the Russian population, in Russian-speaking population in Ukraine, but also in abroad, right, and in Russia itself. So we could potentially see this also developed, which is, I would say, it's also a type of cyber resilience in addition to the sort of hardcore military fighting in cyberspace.
Eneken, Greg, anything to add on that point? We have a number of questions. Eneken, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I maybe see it slightly differently in terms of it's rather easy to envisage that this kind of situation can go into what we are seeing, for example, between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and India, Pakistan, where there's exchanges of cyber fire all the time. But I'd wonder, first of all, I think states are broadly in agreement that they prefer to have this monopoly of cyber violence also somewhat under government control. And on the other hand, it comes to this, that these operations, we know that Russia is very capable of also letting their patriotic hackers and other sympathizers counter, but at the same time, I would say that this weakens potentially the Ukrainian government's ability to mobilize on the main issue at hand. So it's a two-edged sword, the way I see it.
I mean, it's an interesting question, Eneken. If I could just pause you there. We had another question from Jona Bergdorfer, which talked about organized cybercrime in countries like Russia. So your point about the countries wanting to have a monopoly of cyber power. I mean, is there any evidence that the Russian attacks on Ukraine have been autonomous of the state, or to some degree one step removed from the state, or are these, as we understand them, to be entirely kind of directed by the core Russian state?
So maybe like the distinction here that you highlight is very important. In the Russian case, they are largely not so loosely, but still loosely coupled with the state, whereas in the Ukrainian case, this would be more of an improvisation and therefore extremely dangerous.
Okay, Greg, any thoughts on that before I move on to the next question?
Just worth saying, I think that the Ukrainian diaspora may be more active and more capable in cyber resistance to the Russian invasion. So we just have to watch this space, I guess. Thank you.
Okay, so Greg, I'm going to ask this one to you because you've co-authored this report and it links Russia and China. There's been a lot of commentary over the last week or two about the relationship between Russia and China in the aftermath of the meeting between Presidents Xi and Putin around the time of the Beijing Olympics, and the 5,000 plus word statement that was co-produced by the two countries, which came which was unusual. Rodrigo Mura, who's a PhD student at Essex University looking at Chinese geoeconomics, asks, is there any evidence that China is in some way an enabler of Russian cyber capabilities? Or to put this another way, what is the relationship between the Chinese and the Russian state? Do they share technologies? Do they learn from one another? Or is it really an entirely separate set of operations to the extent that one can know these things with certainty?
Yeah, thanks, James, and thanks, Rodrigo. I think it's fair to say that it's unlikely that the level of trust between the Russian intelligence agencies and the Chinese intelligence agencies would be sufficient for there to be much sharing of information. We can observe that even in the case of allied intelligence cooperation against Islamic State, so at a certain point, the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia and probably the Netherlands undertook coordinated offensive operations in cyberspace against Islamic State. To do that, it's highly unlikely that any of those four countries shared too much information about exactly how they were going to do it. They probably would have agreed in broad terms what the targets might be, what the best attack options were. But in cyberspace alliances, you don't get the same degree of what you might call mixing of personnel and mixing of units that you might expect, for example, in an alliance operation by the army on a battlefield where you have, say, the Australian tanks lining up beside the British tanks and quite good communication, seeing what the other side is doing. So whatever cooperation there might be between China and Russia in cyberspace, I think it would be very much at arm's length. They certainly wouldn't be sharing the sort of intelligence that countries like the NATO countries or the Five Eyes routinely share. Thanks.
Thanks, Greg. So I'm going to ask a question now from somebody known only as anonymous attendee amongst the 200 or so people who registered for this. Not everyone's given us their name, but whoever anonymous attendee is, they've asked a very good question, and they also get points because they appear already to have read the report that we're launching this evening. So let me just read that. Anonymous attendee asks, it was mentioned in your paper that Russia's preferred cyber vector is disinformation, usually through its media narratives and social media. In this ongoing conflict with Ukraine, would you say that the tactics and techniques used in Russian influence operations have evolved or become more sophisticated compared to previous conflicts? And anonymous attendee references the annexation of Crimea and the 2008 campaign in Georgia. Maybe I'll ask Eneken, if she has any thoughts on that, or Nadiya, and then come back to Greg. Has, in a sense, these influence operations, have they become much more sophisticated, or are they still pretty much the way they used to run?
Well, I would say they have not become much more sophisticated. I'd say that the Russian influence operations have become much more they have a much wider reach. So it used to be something that the countries in the near Russian vicinity need to be concerned about, or its biggest rivals. But I would say now everybody in the world has some experience with Russian influence operations. But it goes back to what I said earlier, that I think they get away with rather robust techniques and tactics that have worked in the past and still work, and that says more about us than them.
Nadiya?
Yeah, if I can add, I agree. They became they have much wider reach. They are very sort of fluid and they are adapting, right? So if you talk about Georgia 2008, they were very brief. I mean, there were a few days. It was nothing sort of on the same scale as we've seen in Crimea, Ukraine, and also other countries. But also they are learning their lessons, right? So they are using all possible sort of channels that are to reach different audiences, right? So I mentioned like some prior research on this topic actually demonstrates that unlike a lot of people think that social media is the most effective channel to reach various audiences. In the case of Ukraine, TV and partisan television actually has an impact on the population. So they are adapting depending on which groups they're trying to target, which countries they're trying to achieve. As I mentioned, there's also constant change in narratives, right? They're not only saying, Russia is great, come join us. Now they are like very eloquently attacking the West and trying to shape people's minds. So they are constantly adapting and learning and expanding their medium as well as the audiences that they're attempting to achieve.
Greg, any quick thoughts on this one?
Yes, just quickly. I totally agree with Eneken and Nadiya in respect of what we've seen of Russian information operations, what you might call narrowly defined in terms of these public-facing things that they've been doing. But I think the US operations against the US presidential election, the Russian operations against the US presidential election in 2016, which involved coordination of covert intelligence operations, cyber operations, and these public-facing information activities, was profoundly different from what we've seen, and a bit of a wake-up call. So it's interesting to sort of compare really how clumsy they've been, I think, in many aspects of the Ukraine operations, how unsophisticated they've been, but really how they were able to pull off this amazing sort of intervention in United States politics. Thanks.
Maybe if I could add to that point, if I may, I think that's also brings us again to this question of the target, right? And as we ask the question about cyber operations in Ukraine, I don't know if they need to be very sophisticated in the case of Ukraine, but they had to be as creative and as sophisticated in the case of the US.
Let me, so we've only got a few minutes left, so we're going to wrap up a little before the top of the half hour and let people get about their day, either closing their day in Singapore or beginning it in Georgia or wherever you may be. But we heard a few questions on, in a sense, what other countries should learn from this. So Alptekin Toprak asks, what could be a permanent solution to cyber attacks and the kind of future hazardous side effects of cyber attacks that we've seen? I mean, I suppose another way of asking that question is, if other countries are looking at what's happened to Ukraine, you could be Taiwan, you could be, I mean, any less powerful country looking at a more powerful neighbor and thinking, what can you do to improve your cyber resilience and build up your cyber defenses? Then what will others learn from this instance, this set of events in the cyber domain? Greg, maybe again, as the co-author of our report, let me start with you and then I'll go to Eneken and Nadiya.
Yeah, well, thanks, James. I think I'd sort of paraphrase myself, almost repeating myself. I think I wouldn't be learning from Russia and Ukraine. I don't think that they've done terribly well. A lot of their operations have been exposed. They've been pretty old-fashioned and clumsy. I'd be learning from the United States and studying very closely. I'd be learning from Israel. And yeah, so I think that's what my answer would be. Thank you, James.
Eneken, Nadiya, anything that you'd like to say? Maybe Eneken first and then Nadiya.
So I'd say two things to come to mind. First, the situation underlines how seriously we need to take cyber as a precursor to a conflict. And again, it's not cyber conflict. In almost all cases, it's a pre-existing rivalry. And so where cyber intensifies, there is a good reason to like read into the situation again and see how and why it is changing. And then when it comes to now using cyber operations, I think a really critical question to get our heads around is cyber, after all, a better way to conflict? And that goes to that if everything on the ground were limited to cyber, we would have a quite different situation to deal with. And so the question remains, like, are we moving into a phase of international relations where we want to have some of a controlled environment of not hostilities, but rivalry and conflict, and therefore cyber offers that to an extent more than before.
This will be a little
Nadiya?
bit not original and mention something that has been on people's mind in Ukraine for a long time, and it's not related to cyber, which I agree with Greg that we don't necessarily need to learn from Ukraine as much in the cyber in terms of the cyber operations. The only thing is just you need to keep working with your allies and learning from them, which is NATO countries and the US is sort of the leader and learning from the best. But the point I'd like to mention is about the sort of nuclear weapon, right? So when the conflict in Ukraine in 2014 started, there was a lot of discussion among Ukrainians, and I'm sure among other smaller countries, whether it would have evolved the way it did if Ukraine continued possessing a nuclear weapon. And so I think the question is still today, what kind of lessons we'll learn about importance of giving up weapon, importance of not giving nuclear weapon when we have this large country that possesses nuclear weapon just rolling through Ukraine, and not a lot could be done, right? Again, sorry for switching from the cyber sort of digital realm to more like conventional, but it's a sort of very realistic perspective on the situation.
So let me conclude our discussion by, in a sense, asking you to cast your eyes forward. I mean, I know that we're analysts, and so not really in the business of prognosticating, but I mean, I would be interested to hear your reflections on the way you could conceive of cyber being used in the coming period of what looks like it may be a quite protracted conflict. We had a number of questions in this regard. So Conor McNamara was one who said, what are your thoughts on additional cyber attacks against Ukraine's critical national infrastructure and the potential spillover to other European countries? But, there may be other ways in which you might envisage cyber playing a role. Or you might tell me, as seems to have been a theme, that maybe actually we've now entered a phase of this conflict in which cyber will be a second order consideration compared to the kinetic warfare that we're seeing. Greg, do you want to pick this open and just tell us a little bit about what you might expect to see in the weeks and months ahead, given we are to some degree in uncharted territory here?
Yeah, thanks, James. I'd like to pull out of the report something we haven't really talked about. That's the role of the Central Intelligence Agency in cyber operations. So we always think of the National Security Agency or Cyber Command, but the Central Intelligence Agency has a capability to conduct cyber operations, often in partnership with the National Security Agency. It's almost certain, although we've no proof, but almost certain, based on the number of top secret documents that have leaked from China, that the CIA has been engaged in a hack and leak campaign against China. So I think what we're going to see unleashed on Russia in the next coming weeks even is a massive CIA-led hack and leak campaign against the Russian leadership. And so this is, it's not often talked about, but I think it's a really important dimension. Let's see what happens.
Nadiya, would you care to have a look at the same question?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there has been a discussion about potential attacks on critical infrastructure, and absolutely they could take place. But as I mentioned in my opening remarks, whether the strategic value and the impact of this campaign will be as huge as it's being described, I sort of doubt it. But also there has been serious concerns about the potential unintended disruption or spillover effects outside of Ukraine. And I think the most sort of serious potential targets could be those companies that are working with the Ukrainian companies, right? So that could be something that we should be worrying about.
And Eneken, let me give the last word to you. What do you think we might see in the coming period?
Well, it's hard to not agree to what has been put on the table. My speculation is that it is not necessarily in Russian immediate interest right now to see a spillover of something beyond Ukraine, and because I think the question is how to affect the domestic morale. So any critical infrastructure attacks are more likely to shape situation within Ukraine. In terms of, I guess we could anticipate further attacks that directly affect this ability to mobilize, ability to coordinate, ability to provide reassurance by Ukrainian authorities, or even to let the world get the full picture of what is happening. So, like again, an old playbook. And then information operations that literally paint the situation for outsiders. So that's to be expected. But I'd like to just take up one more question, or like just address one more question that was asked in the chat, which is, do we see countries shying away from using cyber in the light of everything that's ongoing? And I think it's a good time for us to think about the sustainable use of information communication technologies in our societies, because our situations are all unique, as is the Ukrainian, and it's just a good reminder for all of us to take a step back and look at where we are.
Okay, thank you to all three of my panelists this evening. We're going to wrap up our discussion there, but I would commend the report by Greg and his co-authors, which is live on the IISS website. This is part of an ongoing stream of research that Greg and others in the IISS, including one of our senior advisors, Marcus Willett, is pursuing at the moment, and we'll be continuing to look at. If this evening's seminar or webinar was enticing, then tomorrow evening we have another one with our colleague Nigel Gould-Davis, who's one of the IISS's main Russia experts, looking at Russia, the West, and economic statecraft. The details of that are on the IISS website. Meantime, let me say thank you to all three of my panelists on your behalf: Eneken Tikk in Finland, Nadiya Kostyuk in Georgia in the US, and my own colleague Greg Austin here in Singapore. Thank you so much for watching this event. I hope you enjoy the report. Good evening.